Hello, everyone. Happy Wednesday again. We are here for week 3 of Canadian Whiskey certification. A special hello to our 100 classmates that are joining us today. Like I said, it is week 3. Today we're talking about maturation and flavor, joined again by Gina and Dave, our educators, and also Ricky, our Spanish language translator. He's going to introduce himself in just a second. But before we get started, whether you're joining us on YouTube or Facebook, make sure that you give us a like, give this video a like, subscribe so you can keep seeing all of this great content. And then also, I just have to remind you that today is the last day to apply for Camp Run Amok. Camp Run Amok is the 7-day American whiskey camp in Louisville, Kentucky. The link for that is right here, camprunamok.org/apply2023. Like I said, today is the last day for it. So if you haven't yet applied, please do that. So I'm going to pass it over to Gina and Dave to get us going.
Hi, folks. Welcome back to week 3. We're going to be looking over maturation and flavor today, continuing on production from last week. Wanted to remind, as Liz pointed out, our good pal Ricky is here, and if you need anything translated in Spanish, Ricky's here, right, Ricky?
Yes, sir. Cualquier pregunta, cualquier duda, mándame un email y yo te ayudo. Back to you, Dave.
Oh, amazing. He called me sir. I just feel so important today. Speaking of important, we've got Gina Fawcett, who's ready to take us through. This is, I guess, our shortest class of the 4, is it not, Gina, or of the 8? So today we'll have a little more time for questions, and we'll get to taste a couple of whiskeys. Get out your J.P. Weiser's 18 and Pike Creek 10-year-old for later in the class. But right now I'm going to shut up and let Gina take it from here.
All right, and away we go. So hello, everybody. Welcome to week 3. Like everyone else has said before me, we're excited to get started. And this week we are headed into maturation. So first, we're going to talk about the warehouses specifically. Of course, specifically the warehouses that we have up at Hiram Walker. They are called the Pike Creek warehouses. Now, they sit about 20 minutes away from the actual distillery, so it's not right there on campus. But there are 16 buildings, as you can see on this overhead shot, and they're all holding barrels of whiskey. Now, there's over 1.6 million barrels. We touched on this last week in these warehouses, and they are stacked 6 pallets high. Each row is going to have about 600 barrels. So we're just trying to give you scope of what we have so you can really see the multitude of examples aging at Hiram Walker. And then another really important thing about these warehouses is that they're not temperature controlled. So see all that rust on the rings of these barrels? That is due to not having temperature control in our warehouses. You know, like we talked about very briefly, the major temperature fluctuations in Windsor, in Canada in general, but Windsor sits right on the Great Lakes watershed, right? That's our water source. Now, that also means that we have super humid summers, hot and humid, just like Louisville, Kentucky. But we are north, and the winters can get very cold. A few years back, it was -40. So imagine that major temperature fluctuation and how that is really influencing the flavors that are coming to life as the spirits age in the warehouses. So really, these barrels are expanding and contracting. Some people would call that breathing, the barrel's breathing, you know, but that is happening with these major temperature fluctuations, you know, a lot more in our warehouses. And that's really going to affect how the whiskey ages. And we'll get to that a little bit later. Now, that rust on the outside of the barrels, that's from all the condensation that happens, again, from the temperature fluctuations. So, that's really not affecting the whiskey on the inside at all. We're not seeing rust come into the whiskey or anything like that, but that really visually from the outside shows you what is happening in those warehouses. Let's touch on the regulations once more, shall we? So the regulations, when we really dig into the maturation regulations for Canadian whiskey, of course, they're called Canadian whiskey, Canadian rye whiskey, or rye whiskey. That is the one category that all of the whiskeys follow this one category of rules. But it says that must be aged in small wood for not less than 3 years. Okay, not less than 3 years, easy. Minimum 3-year age statement to have a Canadian whiskey. Doesn't have to say it on the label, but to be a Canadian whiskey has to be at least 3 years old. Small wood, what does that mean? Well, it means less than or equal to actually 700 liters in volume, the barrel size. So, just to give you a little scope with these illustrations here, on size, a 700 liter barrel is quite large. Most whiskey distilleries are not aging whiskey in a 700 liter barrel. You'd be spending a lot of money on a large barrel and not getting as much wood contact and as much wood influence on the final product, that you might want to have. And what we're really using at Hiram Walker for the most part are 250 liter, 225 liter barrels in that range. Typically we'll use like an American whiskey style barrel. There's a lot. Like I said, we've got 1.6 million barrels at Pike Creek, right? We can use any type of wood. Now here comes another one of those variables in all the different whiskeys and styles that are aging in the warehouse for the blender to work with at the end of the day. So the most common ones that we are using in our Hiram Walker whiskeys would be new white American oak, once used bourbon casks, or multiple use Canadian whiskey cask. And that's what you'll see most of throughout our tastings. That's what we use most of. But lots of experimentation going on and lots of aging for whiskeys that have, special releases or building new blends, new flavor profiles. So what's all in the warehouses? We've got rum casks. We've got Hungarian oak, red oak, Speyside single malt oaks, casks, tequila, French oak. That actually is one of my favorites. It gives a very silky kind of texture to the whiskey that I love. Oloroso cask. We've got Pedro Jimenez, Madeira, port. The list goes on and on and on. Even inserts. Now, this list isn't by any means exhaustive of what's in those warehouses, but I really just wanted to show you what's going on at Pike Creek in the Pike Creek warehouses. What are all of the options for our master blender to work with at the end of the day? And here are some of them. Dilution. So remember last week in production, we talked about the whiskeys coming out of the different stills at different ABVs. Single column distillation, we come out at around 70 ABV. Double column, 94, sometimes pushing up to 95%. And then our column into a pot still, that long pot distillation coming out at 80% ABV. That is then getting diluted before it goes into the barrel. 58% for single column and the column and pot distillation styles, and then 76% ABV on the double column distillation. And I know someone's going to ask why those specific numbers. Don is actually going to talk to us about that tomorrow in our private workshop in depth. But it's really not as romantic or even scientific as any of us would have maybe hoped. It's kind of a number that was chosen in the 50s and they've just stuck to it. But he'll go into that next week a little bit more. Okay, so here's a video of our drain and fill. This video is playing at about 20 times its actual speed. So these barrels move off the truck onto this conveyor belt very, very slowly. We would be here all day if we watched this in real time. They move on down the conveyor belt, and as they move down, the bungs are going to be pulled out from the top. A tube-like vacuum goes in and sucks all the whiskey that has been aging in them for years, sucks that out. It keeps moving down the conveyor belt. Another tube goes in and fills the whiskey with new spirit, brand new spirit. Now, some of them are hand filled. If we have a small batch or a special release going out, then they will hand fill those barrels. But for the most part, when we're doing our regular whiskeys that we produce and our regular bottlings, then that's going to move down that conveyor line. And that's why at any given time, we can really say 1.6 million barrels, because if we are draining 1,100 barrels that day, those 1,100 barrels are immediately getting refilled and going right back into the warehouses with new whiskey in them for different purposes. So lots of planning involved in what's coming out, what's going back into them, and where they're going in the warehouse. Okay, so now let's dig into some barrel influence. Charring specifically. What does charring a barrel do to the whiskey? Two major things: removing sulfur and adding wood extract. So when you char a barrel, remember, you're lighting this thing up. Look at that fire, right? And you're burning the wood inside, a little layer of that wood, and you're really, in doing so, creating a layer of carbon. That layer of carbon acts much like a Brita filter would. Okay, it's going to remove things that we don't want, specifically sulfur notes. Now, last week we talked about this in relationship to distillation. However, this week, let's look back at distillation and then how that might influence what char level we choose in our barrels. So remember, if we have a distillation with very little copper, maybe a stainless steel still, that might have some copper wiring at the top or copper plates in it or copper somewhere, I'm sure, but maybe just a little bit of copper. We need more sulfur removal. That copper might not do the entire job. And again, we don't want to smell and taste sulfur in our whiskey. But if we have a distillation with a lot of copper, then we've already removed most of that sulfur, and we might not need as much char. So for that purpose alone, we might choose a less char level on our barrels. As far as adding wood extract, now charring the barrel is going to degrade your cellulose, your hemicellulose, and your lignin, the things that make up the wood fibers of the barrel. It's also going to develop some oak lactones, and we're going to talk about those in a little bit. This is a chart that was part of Dr. Don Livermore's dissertation. But it's really great. He studied the influence of wood and maturation as part of his dissertation, and we'll all be very lucky to kind of dive into that tomorrow with him in our private session. But if you look at this chart specifically, first off, look at the wood extract, where it's primarily coming into the whiskey. And that's in that first 200 days. Whether it be a number 2 barrel, a number 4 barrel, a bourbon cask, or a multiple use cask that we've used over and over, most of the wood extract is happening or coming into our whiskey in the first 200 days. Now, it continues to come into the whiskey and impart itself into the whiskey after that, but at a much slower rate. And it starts to plateau at some point as well, where then we're just seeing other effects of maturation. But specific to adding wood extract in, adding flavor, color, etc., primarily that is happening in the first 200 days. Now, the other interesting thing about this chart is most people might think that the deeper the char, 4 millimeter depth, the number 4 char level, the more wood extract you would get. However, that really didn't prove to be true. What we see here is you actually get more wood extract into your whiskey using a number 2 or 2 millimeter depth of char. Now you're going to get less sulfur removal. So depending on what you need for your whiskey and your final product will really determine what char level you're going to use on your barrels. So let's look a little closer at hemicellulose, cellulose, and lignin. We're going to refer to cellulose kind of as the bricks of the wood fibers, okay? This makes up about 40 to 50% of the wood fibers. They're very large dextrose units, 10,000 units, very large, okay, pieces here, making up that wood fiber. Your hemicellulose we're going to refer to as like the loose bricks in the wall. There's less of them. They're really making up 15 to 25%, and they're much smaller. And then the lignin is kind of what we would refer to as the mortar in our brick wall analogy. 10 to 20%. This is really bringing it all together, gluing it all together, keeping it all fastened together as that wood fiber. When these things are heated, they are broken down, broken apart, and now these flavor compounds start to come to life. Caramel, toffee, maple, vanilla, roasted peanut, leather, all kinds of things, and more than I listed there. But those are some main flavors that can come directly from breaking down cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. And that all comes from charring our barrel. Other barrel influences, tannins. And I know Dawn is going to dive very deep into tannins tomorrow, but we'll touch on it here. What are they? They're very odorless. So you can't really smell tannins in your whiskey, but they are bitter and astringent. I always feel kind of a dryness on the gums of my mouth when something is very tannic. Some people would describe it as chalky or tea-like even, that dryness. Oak lactones, we touched on these earlier. What are they? They're primarily coconut. It imparts a lot of coconut flavor into your whiskey. Now, translactones also exist, and depending on the ratio of translactones, or I should say oak lactones to translactones, will kind of depend on what flavor your barrels are giving you. So for instance, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. They're pretty equal in a French oak barrel. And so you're actually going to get a little bit more vanilla coming out. But American oak, because there are more oak lactones than translactones, you'll actually get a little bit more coconut than vanilla. And then, of course, another wood extract would be color. Depending on length of time in the barrel, the type of wood being used, how new is that barrel, how many times has it been used, much like a tea bag. This analogy has been used several times, but it's a good one. The more you use it, the less it's going to give you color, flavor, etc. And the same goes for barrels. But sometimes using them multiple times, we're doing that on purpose to allow another part of maturation, the terroir or the environment, to affect the whiskey in a very specific way and show that off. So let's talk about diffusion. Diffusion is a scientific term for barrel finishing. And we see this on labels all over the place, all kinds of whiskeys. Everyone is barrel finishing these days, right? Finished in rum barrels, finished in port barrels, etc., etc. Well, the scientific term is diffusion. And what is actually happening when we use a finishing barrel? So using a finishing barrel means that we've aged the whiskey, and then we're going to put it into a barrel that has had something else in it before. So let's use rum as an example today because we are going to taste Pike Creek that is finished in rum casks. So we're going to put our whiskey into these rum barrels. What's happening? We have rum soaked into this wood. You see all those little green dots under that magnifying glass there? Those are the molecules of rum. It is going to come to an equilibrium between the whiskey and the wood. Some people might think it all goes into the whiskey, but it actually doesn't. It naturally comes to an equilibrium and spreads itself out equally. So, different flavors we might get from different types of finishing barrels. Walnuts and raisins from sherry casks or prunes. Port, I always love it's slightly spicy, slightly fruity, and has a nice little almost dark chocolate note to it. Rum, we often get island spices, brown sugar notes, dried fruit notes from bourbon casks, which we see a lot in our whiskeys because we use bourbon cask a lot. Caramel, vanilla, of course. And referring back to Dawn's chart on wood extract, now let's look at diffusion. And diffusion really happens in that first 200 days as well. So a lot in maturation when we're talking about barrels is really happening in that first 200 days. After 200 days, your molecules have really come to equilibrium. You're not getting more port imparted into your whiskey. But you may feel that the port flavor gets stronger or more concentrated. And that simply is because over time, with the angel share and evaporation, those port flavor compounds aren't being evaporated with the angel share. And so that flavor, those flavor notes or compounds might be concentrated through time a little bit more, but there's not actually more of that liquid going into the whiskey. And finally, terroir. So this is a highly debated topic within the whiskey industry. Does whiskey have terroir? And people feel very strongly one way or another. I do as well. And everyone at Hiram Walker, because we have proof that there is terroir. It happens in our warehouses. So in Windsor, like I said, we have these drastic temperature fluctuations. What does that mean? More ethyl acetate is created. So the whiskey goes into the warehouse, in the barrel, into the warehouse, and we have these drastic temperature fluctuations happening from season to season. The barrels are breathing more than they might in another environment or another terroir. And when oxygen reacts with alcohol, it sets off a series of chemical reactions, about 10 different chemical reactions. At the end of this series, and it happens very, very quickly, at the end of this series of chemical reactions, we end up with ethyl acetate. So the more your barrels are breathing, expanding, contracting, the oxygen getting to the whiskey, then the more ethyl acetate development you're going to see. So in an environment like Scotland, that is a more temperate climate, more even-keeled, right? They're not going to see as much ethyl acetate development. There will be ethyl acetate development, there always is, but they're not going to see as much. Somewhere very, very hot and humid, like the Caribbean perhaps, you might see a lot of ethyl acetate development. So it really depends on your terroir or your environment on how the barrels are breathing, the rate that they're allowing oxygen to react with the alcohol, and then setting off that series of chemical reactions. And you can see here the ethyl acetate formation here in a double column distilled corn whiskey. Now we're very specifically putting a double column distilled corn whiskey into multiple use Canadian barrels to show off this ethyl acetate. What is that giving us? Green apple. a sweet, fruity, light, bright, kind of green apple note. And when we really want to show that off, we will do that for very specific whiskeys, one of which you will taste today. Speaking of, I'm going to pass the mic to Mr. Dave Mitten to take us through 2 beautiful whiskeys.
Hold on there, Professor. We've got quite a few questions we're going to tackle first.
Oh boy, here we go.
Now, just a reminder for our 100 students, if we don't get to all of these questions today, we will. And also, you have 2 hours with Dr. Dawn Livermore, the Doctor of Wood, tomorrow. So lots of time. But Gina, I mean, someone asked, is there use of toasted barrels for maturation at Hiram Walker? That's one question.
Sure. You might know the inventory a little bit better than I, but we certainly use some toasted. It's not super popular for what we're doing, but there are toasted barrels in the warehouse aging.
Agreed.
You might have something to add to that.
Very, very small amount that I know of, but we'll ask Dawn again if there's any changes from what I know. Small amount. Our old buddy Josh, he says deeper char plus less total extract ? Seems counterintuitive.
Yes. So the deeper char, you might want a deeper char if you don't have 100% copper still, or just in your distillation, or you're not putting it through a copper doubler to get more copper contact. So a deeper char, you're not getting a deeper char for more extract. Really we see the number 2 char level kind of be the star of the extract influence on our whiskey. But if you want like a number 4 char or even deeper, it might be because you are trying to take out some sulfur notes that you weren't able to do in your distillation.
And again, Gina and Dawn took us through his presentation for the 100 students tomorrow. And as Gina said, my God, Dawn, we only have 2 hours. Yeah. You're going to go through a lot tomorrow with Dawn, so he'll be touching on this. What's the next one? Carla, does the matured distillate go through a specific filtration process, Professor?
Yes. So after maturation, you saw the drain and fill area at the distillery. Once it's sucked out of those barrels, it's actually going to multiple filtration levels. So it's first going to filter out kind of like bigger chunks of char that might have come out just being sucked through the tube. And then it's going to filter. They do chill filter, and Don actually is going to talk about that tomorrow. He's very passionate about the temperature of chill filtration. So we'll make sure that we get into that tomorrow. But yes, it does go through multiple levels of filtering before bottling.
There are 2, but they're basically the same question. So the last question is, are all of your barrels stored vertically? And do you notice any difference in the angel share between all those different types of oak?
Ooh, the angel share part, I think we have to ask Don. I don't know the answer to that on the difference of angel share between different types of wood. I would also imagine the amount of times that they're used is going to also influence how much angel share they're giving us. I know Dave's when he takes us through this tasting, he's going to share with us the massive amounts of angel share that happens at Hiram Walker. But the beginning of that question, are they all stored vertically? Yes, at Hiram Walker, they are all palletized. It's, a massive inventory of barrels. And so using a forklift and not rolling your barrels onto ricks is not only more economical and efficient, but it's also safer for everyone. It's a safety issue as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, and I've been fortunate enough to have been in numerous warehouses over the last 15, 20 years. And when you think of like going into some of the big, massive, crazy brands, a lot of those are stacked vertically, like overseas. And yeah, it's just when you're going through so much. I think that kind of concludes questions for this moment. And then we're going to have Dr. Dawn tomorrow to really get into things for the 100 students. But shall we all grab our JP Weiser's 18?
Let's do it.
There it is. Liz and Jesse have it up there. So don't forget, we did go over this. Was it last week or the week before? I think it was last week. We touched on it. That's right, because, or no, that's the other one. We're doing a few different courses right now, so sometimes I get mixed up. So the JP Weiser's 18, as Gina just took us through an amazing, journey through maturation at Hiram Walker and Sons Distillery. This, again, reminding you, it is our 100% corn whiskey. Beautiful blend of double column distilled corn aged in ex-Canadian whiskey casks. A reminder where that is an ex-bourbon cask that we use over and over again. And it's, that emphasizes a lot of the grain and yeast characteristics. You get a lot of mature oak, autumn florals. Gina just mentioned Angel Share, and we had a couple questions about it. So being in the most southern tip of Canada, as you've learned during this course, we're so far down that when you want to drive to Detroit, which is across the river, we have to drive north to get to you. We have to drive north from Canada to get to the United States of America, is how far down we dip on the Great Lakes. So our summers, we get as hot as 35 degrees Celsius. That's about 95 Fahrenheit. We'll get up to 40 degrees Celsius on really hot days. Our winters, we can go down. There's usually a few days of the year that goes to negative 40 Celsius, and that is when Celsius and Fahrenheit line up. That is negative 40 Fahrenheit. We had a couple days last week where it was almost negative 30. Keeps you tough, keeps you buying warm winter jackets. But you can imagine during these months in the winter, the barrels, everything in those warehouses being non-temperature controlled freezes. The barrels have a coating of frost over them almost. But in the summer months, spring, summer, April, May, the sun starts beating down, warmer on the roofs of the warehouses. We start opening up the doors, warm air is coming in, that frost melts, barrels start expanding. As Gina just showed you a picture of the rusty hoops, usually the month of May, you'll go in and it looks like barrels are leaking because the floors are wet, but that's just the condensation from the warehouses. Dawn will get more into that tomorrow. Out of those 1.6 million barrels, we lose 3% in evaporation to the Angels every year, and that equals out to 48,000 barrels of whiskey just floats up into the sky and is gone. So needless to say, that's a lot of whiskey we go through. Don will probably tell you tomorrow, this is how his brain works. He has figured it out that losing those 48,000 barrels equivalent to the distillery working for 6 weeks for free every year. So think about that if you're an owner or operator of a business. Pretty crazy. We should probably try this whiskey, right? We've done it before. I mean, it is a beautiful kind of deep amber in color. On the nose, I mean, I get an abundance of that vanilla cedar, a little bit of fresh pine, those autumn florals I was talking about, the mature oak. Now, you probably remember this is a very soft, if not our lightest whiskey. Gina, are you not joining us?
I am.
I get a lot of that mature oak. Again, the baked apples, almost the green apple dipped in caramel that we touched on last week, but now you're kind of understanding where Gina went into the ethyl acetate, talking about that. And I'm sure you already got this from her saying it, but when you think about it, this light style double column distilled corn aged in an ex-Canadian whiskey cask, this is where the ethyl acetate, that green apple, really shines through compared to Scotch whiskey over the age of 10 years, where it could be the barley, peated barley, the way it's distilled, bourbon, the way the blend goes and distilled, the way it's aged. A lot of that, they're just bigger, more powerful whiskeys that will cover up that soft green apple, but it's kind of shining through in this whiskey. So this is one of my favorites. I love it. Easy sipping. We always recommend this. I mentioned last week. On its own, cube of ice, little drop of water. You could make a really nice cocktail with it, but it would be overpowered by a big vermouth or herbal liqueur. Oh, Lucas just said it's a lovely finish. And it is. It's light on the nose. Like you say, very light, soft style. Love this one.
Carla is asking about government taxes on these barrels and if that's similar to the U.S. tax laws. I do know Don is going into that in depth tomorrow.
But
it's up to you how much you want to go into that.
Correct me if I am wrong when I say this, Gina. I think it is, okay, no one quote me on this. We'll see what Don says tomorrow. But I believe each barrel, all 1.6 million, are worth $1,000 each in excise tax. So do the math.
That's what I understand as well. Yep.
When you think about that, you know, any Canadians on this call, you know, we'll repeating our history course is the first 5 taxpayers in Canada were the first biggest whiskey barons: Gooderham and Morts, J.P. Weisers, Hiram Walker, Henry Corby. Like, these were the people that helped build Canada. We probably need these whiskey makers on our little funny colored plastic money. I think that would be great. Anyway, I love our colored plastic funny money. Let's try some Pike Creek, shall we? I think Liz and Jess are going to throw up Pike Creek. We haven't had this one yet. This is our Pike Creek 10-year-old whiskey. This is a fun one. This is one of the whiskeys that when this company approached me to join up that I was using at my little spots in Toronto, one of them. So this starts off in a very traditional manner for Canadian whiskey. Majority of it is that soft double column distilled corn that you just had in the J.P. Weisers 18, so very light, easy sipping. We do blend in a small amount, less than 5% of once column distilled rye whiskey, both age and ex-bourbon casks. So you're going to have, it's a beautiful blend, soft, creamy, rich corn, little touch of big spicy rye, the ex-bourbon cask giving like dried fruit notes to it. But after the 10 years, we re-gaged this whiskey in Demerara rum barrels. And at Hiram Walker, as I think you've figured out along our journey so far, we don't just make Canadian whiskey. We make a lot of different spirits, liqueurs. We make a couple of rums. So one of the rums that we do make, barrels come up from the Caribbean, and we obviously blend the rums. We've got the leftover casks, which Don will be able to speak to tomorrow, and we'll put this whiskey into those casks for 200 days. Production purposes, as Gina also spoke to, of, you know, the diffusion. And from that, you know, looking at it, it's like you've got this beautiful copper color. On the nose, again, I always kind of get some raisins. I get a little bit of honey, lots of brown sugar, always brown sugar, bit of vanilla. It's in my brain that you get a little bit of the apple, that green apple. And, you know, somebody said the other day a little like dried orange, and I don't disagree with that. It is, if the J.P. Weisers 18 you just had was the softest, smoothest, this is one of the smoothest, roundest, and probably sweetest whiskey. Yeah, someone just said, Lucas said, if you didn't mention the Demerara rum, the Demerara would be obvious. I won't lie, the first time I tried this whiskey and I was learning about our rules and regulations, I'd asked if we had used the 9.09 rule where you could blend in an aged spirit, and we don't with this, but I thought we might have because it is so evident. Now, first taste, I do get a bit of that honeycomb. You certainly get the toffee, island spices, little subtle island spices, almost a Christmas or holiday cake, I should say. and this is a dangerously easy whiskey to sip. As you can tell, it goes down very smoothly. It is that rich sweetness, 42 ABV, 84 proof. This is also one where Gina and I, we're not marketers, we're educators. So we like when things happen naturally instead of, us telling people how to use our products. And Pike Creek was a great example. Wherever this has been sold, Canada, parts of the US, good chunk of it in Europe, in the warmer summer months, bartenders are mixing this, like they're muddling it up with herbs, crushed ice, fresh fruits, fresh juices. They're making like tropical style drinks, which really makes sense with this. But then it's the other end of the spectrum. You don't really see people making Manhattans and classic cocktails with this whiskey per se. But in the winter months, they're doing flips, they're doing coffee cocktails, they're doing more dessert style cocktails, which also makes perfect sense with this style of whiskey. It's often compared to kind of a notes of obviously rum, little cognac, so it's a great after dinner whiskey. Burnt orange oils, totally. One of my faves.
Just to remind everyone, this is the whiskey that Christina Vieira used. So in your first week in our private workshop with a few bartenders, this is the whiskey that Christina used. Yeah. We do have a couple questions coming in. One is the 18-year using charred barrels.
Yep, ex-bourbon casks used over and over again, as Don will tell you tomorrow. He will answer you. He is not a marketer either. He'll tell you he uses that barrel till it falls apart. Now, mind you, keep in mind, if you were to use the same barrel to do a J.P. Weiser's 18 4 times, that's about 100 years or close to it.
That's true.
So, he'll go deep into that tomorrow.
Another question, do you blend before or after finishing?
Oh, but the Pike Creek.
That's
a great question. Refresh my memory. We're gonna ask Dawn that tomorrow. Is it blended?
It's blended first. So yeah, they blend the corn and the rye whiskeys after they've aged separately for 10 years, and then they blend them and finish them in the rum cask for, depends on production, honestly, but somewhere between 100 and 200 days, because that's where we're really getting all the, and you can taste it. That rum is in that whiskey, so there's a lot of influence going on finishing. And
pardon me, when I was talking, did I say 200 days or 100?
I don't remember.
Neither do I. We'll have to roll back. But it's 100, correct, for production purposes? I think I might have said 200.
It's give or take. It's give or take.
And I mean, with the Pike Creek too, one thing we didn't mention is it really is the one regular expression of whiskey that we roll out at all times. It's a barrel finish. Now, Pike Creek, occasionally we'll do a release every year. We've done Hungarian oak finish. We have done a PX sherry finish. We've done an Oloroso sherry finish. We've done a Cab Sauv wine finish. We've done a Speyside finish. So that's one of the blended we finish in. But as Gina showed you all of the examples of some of the barrels that we have laying down, which is probably 20 or 30 that I can think of. There's a lot of, at this current time, Dawn might talk about it tomorrow, but there's a lot of 100% rye finishing in a lot of barrels right now. So there's some pretty cool things that'll be coming our way in the next few years of 100% rye whiskeys.
So we have a couple questions coming from Lucas, and they're kind of around the same thing here. So let's start with, when you age a spirit in a barrel and then you're going to finish it in another barrel, for instance, Pike Creek, 10 years, does the time, could we put, if we finished it for 3 years, could we put 13 years on that label, or does it have to say 10 years?
I think if you finished it for 3 years, it would be an extra 3 years of aging in a barrel. Now we just don't ever finish anything for that long. Like you say, it's 100 to 200 days. So it's not
Right.
even an extra year.
Right. But I will say, if this question comes up a lot. So if anyone's wondering, the age for a Canadian whiskey, the age on a label will be the youngest whiskey in the blend. So all of the whiskeys will have been aged at least that long. Some may have been aged more or longer. Let's see. We have a question that, I think this is up to a lot of opinion. And I'm sure there's some science behind it, but I don't know that it affects the whiskey, in my opinion, enough that specific regions would matter based on flavor. But the question is there any strong feeling on the terroir of the grains grown? And I'll give you my opinion, and Dave might have a different one because we've actually never had this conversation. So here we go. But my opinion is we're looking at a very specific species of grain, right? Very specific thing that we are going to purchase from the farmers. Now, we purchase locally for a lot of reasons, one being economical, but also to support the local, our local economy. But it is more efficient and economical to us to buy local grain. However, like I said, if the environment isn't doing what it needs to do to produce the quality of grain that we need, then we will go elsewhere. We will source the grain elsewhere because it's a very specific quality standards that we're looking for, that these grains have to meet and measure up to, and very specific species. So regardless, it's going to give us the flavor that we're looking for in the whiskey if we're meeting the quality standards. And, rye grows really well in Canada. It doesn't grow so well in Texas. It's a different terroir, right? So
it grows really well in colder climates.
Right. Not that you can't grow rye in Texas, you can, but it's not you're not gonna get as much yield out of it, perhaps. And of course, there's all kinds of agricultural technology these days that's changing those things. So it's a lengthy discussion to have. That's kind of my 2 cents off the cuff, but we can also ask Amy and get back to you on that.
Perfectly put. I mean, you already know this. The crew might not, but I mean, Don's going to get into this. He'll probably talk even about different types of rye, for instance, that might be experimenting on right now. But yeah, we buy, that's the honest God truth, buy local. Local doesn't just mean Ontario, Michigan, Illinois. When I started 9 years ago, I think we had even had a really bad season. So I think we bought some rye from Alberta at one point, which is a few provinces over, which isn't necessarily local. But like you say, we can't, as Gina just said, comes down to quality. We need to make sure it is quality grain to go into making the whiskey.
How many times do you reuse the barrels? Which you've touched on, but
I would say Don, don't quote me, but ask Don tomorrow, and he usually answers with until they fall apart. Over and over. And it's for certain things. Like you say, if you're making a light styled corn whiskey, over and over till we fall apart. Don's going to get into that tomorrow very heavily.
Yeah. Okay, someone's asking the name of the chain reaction that causes the ethyl acetate. And actually, it's a series of reactions, of these chemical reactions. And Don has multiple slides that is going to break every chain reaction down, which is why I'm hesitating to go any further, because I really don't want to steal his thunder tomorrow. But just know that tomorrow in our private workshop, we will we will be going through that very thoroughly, those chemical reactions.
Yeah.
So hold tight.
I was gonna say
Hold
it's
tight.
gonna be a lot of fun tomorrow, but just a reminder, I mean, have your notebooks handy, drink a couple extra cups of coffee. Like Dawn is gonna go deep dive in what wood does to spirits tomorrow.
Someone is asking if we get into experimental barrels that have different wood types or finished heads, or is that against regulation?
There's lots of different barrel heads I'm not sure of. We're doing like inserts right now. The barrel heads, I'm not aware of any different barrel heads. We can ask Dawn.
Yeah, I'm not
tomorrow.
either, to be honest.
We'll ask. I know we do inserts. I mean, I can say I tried a lot 40 finished in cherry oak the other month. A cherry wood, pardon me. Cherry oak, cherry wood. It was really nice. I mean, yeah, he's got a lot of different things laying down right now. He's got some black sea casks, which is really interesting. Yeah, if he can get his hands on it, he's experimenting in many different things.
Are there American whiskey brands that are sourcing rye from Canada, or is that not allowed?
There are, I can't speak for all the other distilleries in Canada, even if I know, I can't speak for them. Yes, lots of American companies source whiskey from us, because think of it, as we've been saying, we make everything's a straight whiskey. Basically, it's all rye on its own, it's corn on its own, it's wheat on its own, it's barley on its own. So they can buy from us and make blends. Rules are different, where you can buy, as Canadian whiskey, it has to be fermented, distilled, and aged in Canada to be a Canadian whiskey. But a lot of the American categories, that's not the case. So you can buy a whiskey that was fermented, distilled, and aged in Canada, bottle it in the US, and label American whiskey.
Someone's asking if finishing just means 200 days, and I'll touch on this just because I was talking about it with the diffusion conversation earlier. But if it says finished in whatever barrels, it doesn't mean it was finished for 200 days. At Hiram Walker, most likely it's somewhere between 100 and 200 days, because we know that most of the diffusion process happens during that time. We also, in Canada, remember, have the ability with the 9.09% rule. If we really needed to adjust something, we could legally, if we kept under the 9.09% of adding an ingredient in, that met those regulations. However, it doesn't mean that, because you could finish something for 5-10 years or whatever in another type of cask. It doesn't mean you're trying to pull more of that previous liquid out of the barrel. It means you are trying to continue to age the product, and maybe that might be the wood it's sitting in getting more color through time. It might be the terroir of the specific warehouse and what they're trying to impart into the whiskey. So there's a lot that's going on. It's not just the 200 days. The 200 days really is just showing you that that's the amount of time that really the molecular compounds, those molecules come to equilibrium between the whiskey and the wood in 200 days. So no more of that previous liquid is being imparted into the whiskey. The last question we have, and we'll probably end on this one, is about chill filtering and non-chill filtering, because it's such a buzzword these days. And I will just tell you that Dr. Don Livermore is extremely passionate about this buzzword. He has big feelings about it, and he's going to share those big feelings.
I would say I want to leave it at that. There are.
Yeah.
Gina and I are fortunate enough that we get to, Gina and I travel a lot together. Dawn and I are very rarely in the same place together. But when we are, sometimes we'll do larger whiskey fests or cocktail events. Don and I'll be there, and it's fun to watch Don talk with people when he's passionate about something. And right now, he's really passionate about caramel coloring and non and chill filtering, because I don't know if he agrees with a lot of the things that are out there. So he's going to give you his take on all of that tomorrow. And whatever you get back from it is you're going to find it interesting. He has a lot of scientific backing to comment on that. So just get ready for tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, like Dave said, he's got a lot of scientific backing to his opinions on it, and why he chooses to do specific things all throughout the process and the blending situation. But specifically speaking right now to chill filtering versus non-chill filtering. And I guess there is one more question. We have a couple minutes. Have you experimented with blending multiple types of finished whiskey?
Oh, like barrel finished whiskey.
Mm-hmm.
You know what? Great question. And the answer is I've experimented with Dawn. Gina's not even been with me where, you know what? I'll give myself one of these. Dawn gave me a thumbs up. We were down a few months ago, and as I mentioned before, let's say there were about 25 different lot 40s that were finished in different types of barrels. And we took a day to go through them all, had samples back in the lab, and I started mucking around. I started making some blends with them. And you know what? I'll see if I can find it in my notes, and I'll tell you tomorrow. But it was like a 4 distillate whiskey. So it was 4 straight rye whiskeys finished in 4 types of barrels. And we did a few experiments, and some of them ended up being pretty good. Are any coming out? Not that I know of right now. Dawn would have to approach brand team and get that going. But that's as far as I know the experimenting has gone. And I know it piqued Dawn's interest enough that he's thinking about it now, because that's not something you see a lot of. That's
true. Not a lot of. And, honestly, sometimes you'll see in our whiskeys, like when they come out, well, next week we'll dive, I don't want to get ahead of myself. Next week, we're going to dive into polar histograms and stuff and measuring flavor in these crazy bar graphs. So we'll save that for next week, so I don't deep dive into something we haven't covered yet.
Good idea, Professor.
Yeah. So that covers all the questions. Maybe we shift it back to Liz in case she has any finishing remarks for us.
Awesome. Well, thank you both. That did cover all the questions, but of course, for our students, we will be on live tomorrow in class in the Zoom room. So come with more questions then. We'll see you tomorrow at 3 from 3 to 5 Eastern. Like Gina and Dave both said, this is going to be a heavy class. So bring your notebooks. You're going to want to take lots of notes, ask lots of questions. This one is not to be missed. One more quick reminder that Camp Run Amok applications close today. So if you haven't yet applied, go ahead and do that. The link is camprunamok.org/apply2023. And again, another thing that just can't be missed. So get your applications in. This is our second to last week. We have one more of these classes next week, next Wednesday, same time, same place, 2 p.m. Eastern. We will see you here, whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube. Next week is the last one, so don't miss it. Gina and Dave, thank you again, and we will see you tomorrow.
All right.
Thanks,
see you, everyone. Thanks.
Have a great night.